Well, good afternoon. It's almost afternoon now, almost lunchtime. I hope in the next 15 to 20 minutes to summarize to you what I've been doing in my research and why I think it matters and why I hope you will appreciate the importance as well. So first, I'm going to start by talking about diabetes in older adults and why it's such a growing, not only medical, but public health concern as well. 1/3 of our older adults have diabetes, and of this, about half is undiagnosed. An additional 1/3 have what we call prediabetes, so they haven't quite developed diabetes but are on the way there. And so in some 2/3 of our older adults have some sort of glucose abnormality. And the prevalence of diabetes in older adults will only increase as our population ages. So this is clearly a large public health and economic burden that our society will be facing in the near future. We know that peripheral glucose disposal occurs in different sites of the body at different times of the day. In the fasting state, so before eating the first meal of the day, it occurs primarily in sites of the body that don't depend on insulin, such as the brain. After eating, it occurs primarily in sites of the body that are insulin dependent, such as skeletal muscle. And that's where I'll be talking mostly about today. We know that as people age, insulin resistance tends to increase with older age, and this is due to a variety of factors. Lean body mass declines, there's decreased mitochondrial function. I won't really go into much of that today, but there's also likely some impaired islet insulin secretion as well. And I won't talk too much about that, but needless to say, our older adults are already at a disadvantage as they age in terms of how their islets are functioning and their insulin resistance. However, impaired glucose metabolism is not an unavoidable companion of aging. Not everyone who gets older develops diabetes. And we see this here. This is a graph. On the side here is HOMA-IR, a surrogate marker of insulin resistance. And you don't need to understand the details of what that calculation is, except to see that it rises as people get older. And in those that live to the age of 100, it's actually much lower. And so whether this is a marker or merely an association, it's an interesting finding that those who live beyond the age of 100 actually have relatively well-preserved insulin glucose status. So what I'd like to talk about today is that population that does have insulin resistance with aging, and talk about why older adults with impaired glucose metabolism may represent a vulnerable subset of people in our population at high risk of adverse outcomes. The outcomes I'll talk about are probably not the ones that you're used to hearing about: heart disease, kidney disease, nerve disease. These are all very important, but in our older population, functional status is also very important, and that's what I'll be focusing on today, particularly physical disability, functional limitations such as walking, and accelerated muscle loss, all of which contribute to quality of life in our older adult with diabetes. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of physical functioning and walking. So in a previous life, I used to work with non-human primates off of Smile Island off the coast of Puerto Rico, and as anyone who has ever worked with non-human primates knows, there's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. And I'm not going to go into the evolutionary biology here, but needless to say, locomotion has changed as we look across the species. And one of the things that makes us as humans unique, over here on the right-hand side, is that we walk on 2 feet, bipedalism. And why is this so important? Well, it's actually an energy advantage. Walking upright takes less energy than walking on all fours or even moving with your thumbs. In fact, it takes 25% less energy than required for moving on all 4 legs. And so it might not be surprising that there's been many observational studies, and I've referenced one here if you're interested in JAMA, which is a phenomenal study that shows that higher gait speed in both men and women is associated with increased survival. And this is remarkable, but perhaps not surprising when you think about it as an energy advantage. So why would gait speed predict survival? So it requires a lot of energy, like I talked about. It places demands on multiple organ systems, such as the heart and the lungs. Slowing gait may reflect damaged systems, discoordination of multiple systems, resulting in an energy imbalance. Some have proposed that walking speed may be a simple indicator of the health of the older person. In fact, there are geriatricians who swear that they can tell the health of an older person just by watching them walk. And so there are some who think that walking speed should be the next vital sign. And so this merely underscores the importance of physical function and walking in our older population for health. So now I'll talk a little bit about sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is a loss of muscle mass that occurs with aging, age-related muscle loss. It's derived from the Greek words meaning loss of flesh. And this is important because, again, as people age, their total muscle mass decreases from about 50% of total body weight in young adults to about a quarter by the age of 80. And this is something that just happens as people age. We don't really understand why. It may affect up to half of the older population. We don't have a clear definition, so prevalence estimates are difficult. And it's costly. A 10% reduction in age-related muscle loss would save the United States $1 billion or more each year. And so understanding why this happens and how we can treat it is important. It's a strong risk factor for hospitalization. I already mentioned disability and death in older people. It can improve quality of life and save money if we can understand how to treat it. But there's currently no cure for sarcopenia. We have no idea how to treat age-related muscle loss. And so identification of novel, potentially modifiable targets for this condition are important. So how does this relate to diabetes? So the research that I have done to date has looked at accelerated muscle loss in older adults with diabetes. And here's the research question. So to what degree do high glucose levels represent a risk factor for accelerated muscle loss in diabetes? So why is this important? Not only for our older adult with diabetes, but I already shared with you that all people as they age to a certain degree develop insulin resistance. So could this give us some insight into a target, something that can be changed with therapies we currently have available that can improve muscle function for people as they age? And so for this research, we applied the disablement process, again, often used in geriatric literature, to understand how diabetes affects various parts in the pathway to disability, starting on the left side, low muscle mass, which can lead to low muscle strength, functional limitations, disability, and then ultimately to mortality. So I'm going to walk you through, starting distally, then moving more proximally, into how diabetes can affect various steps of this pathway. So we know that people with diabetes have increased mortality. In fact, this was a very large study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that reported that type 2 diabetes is associated with a reduced lifespan of 6 years for the average 50-year-old person with diabetes compared to a counterpart without. And surprisingly, 40% of this difference was not due to vascular deaths. We think of heart disease, stroke, very important, clearly, in people with diabetes. But there's a big black box. Cancer is also a big one. But 40% of the deaths were not due to cancer or cardiovascular disease. So what were these? The authors mentioned liver disease, kidney disease, infections, and musculoskeletal disease. So I'll talk about how could disability in diabetes relate to the increased risk of death in people with this condition. So what do we know about disability? So disability can be someone in a wheelchair that you see on the side of the street, but we actually have ways to formally define this in our research. There's many different tasks that people can have difficulty with. I've listed some of these here. You might be familiar with activities of daily living, ADLs, such as walking or dressing, or instrumental activities of daily living, such as managing your money, which requires some more complex skills. There's also lower extremity mobility, which is very important, and general physical activities, and leisure and social activities as well. And what we found, you can just focus on the sentence at the bottom, but the data is there, is that in this nationally representative population of U.S. adults, older adults had 2 to 3 times increased odds of disability if they had diabetes compared to without, across all these domains. And this was self-reported, so people filled out a questionnaire and told us if they had difficulty in these different tasks. We also know that people with diabetes walk slower. not everyone with diabetes clearly, but when we look at groups of people. And this seems to be related to the degree of glucose elevation. So in this study that we had done, this was done in the Women's Health and Aging Study of women who were 70 and older in the Baltimore area, we found that those women who had a hemoglobin A1C of 8% or greater compared to those with an A1C of less than 5.5% were 3 to 4-fold more likely to report walking difficulty. And actually, when we measured their walking speed, I'm not showing that data here, they also had lower walking speed as well. So how does this relate to muscle function? Well, in another study that we did, we looked at whether high blood glucose levels were associated with lower muscle strength in people as they age. And again, this gets back to the question, can we identify a target that we can intervene on in people with diabetes to preserve muscle function? And what we found is that those who were in the highest category of A1C actually had lower muscle strength that stayed low up to 10 years later in this study, suggesting that high glucose does somehow relate to the low muscle function we see in people with diabetes. And this is a slide that shows that the dotted line at the bottom is those that are in the highest quartile of A1C. And you can see it's not even that high here. It's 6.1% or greater. And so even people in the prediabetes range were showing lower muscle strength that stayed low as they aged. And as you might expect, again, in another study that we subsequently did, you can see that those in the highest categories of A1C had the lowest muscle mass. So what does this tell us about the pathway to disability in diabetes? Well, we've now done research that shows that not just diabetes, but high blood glucose levels themselves are associated with each step of the disablement process in people with diabetes. And could this be a target that we could intervene on to preserve muscle function in this population? In the last few minutes, I want to now talk about the inverse association. So I talked a little bit about how diabetes can lead to accelerated loss of muscle function and decreased physical function. But now, what about the opposite? Can changes in body composition as people age relate to the increased burden of diabetes that we see in this population? Well, we know that body mass index is a predictor of diabetes. Obesity is well established as a major risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes. That's why we're here. That's what we're talking about. We know that modest weight loss is associated with reduced diabetes risk. So if you intervene, it actually improves. However, weight loss includes not only fat mass, but muscle mass as well. And this may not be desirable in our older adults for the reasons that I just talked about. People who are older are already at a disadvantage with lower muscle mass. So BMI is, in fact, not always a good measure of excess fat mass. And when you account for age, it's associated with fat mass only less than 60% of the time. So it's a good surrogate for most people, but not necessarily in people as they age. We know that BMI is weight over height squared. BMI cut points for obesity were, in fact, based on an increased risk of mortality at a BMI of 30 or greater in the general population. However, the obesity paradox has been described, and this is the idea that those with a BMI of 27 to 30 might actually have a protective effect, might have decreased mortality. There's been conflicting studies that have come out, but it underscores that BMI is not necessarily perfect predictor of mortality or associated with increased adverse outcomes. And the BMI cutoffs that we ordinarily use are shown here for obesity and overweight. So we know that BMI does not account for body composition. So you can see a bodybuilder here, compared to a man who's obese. Same weight, same height, same BMI, different body composition. So this shows why BMI is not always the best measure of excess adiposity, because it doesn't necessarily account for the composition. It also doesn't account for body weight distribution. All these women here have the same BMI, but they have a different distribution of central to peripheral adiposity. And so again, BMI as a measure of where weight is distributed is also very limited. So how does this relate to our older adult? Well, you can see here that these are two people that look the same, but one is the younger person on the left, and you can see here that they have more muscle and less fat, but the one who's older has more fat and less muscle. but they look the same from the outside. In fact, they might have the same total body weight. And so just using BMI is clearly a difficult surrogate for adiposity in our older population. So why does this matter? It matters because the loss of muscle mass that occurs with aging is typically offset by gains in fat mass. So we don't really know what's going on underneath if we just measure weight. And in fact, the weight can look stable or it can increase just slightly as people age, although there are important metabolic changes that are going on that can impact diabetes risk. And it's unclear, while we know that excess adiposity is related to increased risk of diabetes, what about the parallel decline in muscle mass that's occurring in adults as they age? It's unclear how that relates to the increased risk of diabetes in older adults. And this is a summary of the clinical guidelines we have for our older adult with diabetes to demonstrate that we have a range of A1C targets that we aim for. We individualize them based on functional status, expected life expectancy, comorbidities, but we don't know the risks of letting the A1C target go up. What are the risks of uncontrolled hyperglycemia in this population? Again, I just shared with you that high blood glucose levels are associated with accelerated loss of muscle mass and physical function. So where do we go from here? We have a changing paradigm, so keep calm, there's a paradigm shift going on. What are the risks of uncontrolled high blood glucose levels and accelerated muscle loss? We don't know, and we need to know, because our older adults are going to grow in number. We need to know how to manage them, and we really don't know how to optimally treat them with the blood glucose targets. And it's important to understand, because can glucose-lowering therapies improve physical functioning in our older adults with diabetes? Right now, we have clinical guidelines that I shared where we actually shy away from treating our people who are older with these therapies because we're not sure if there's any benefit to glucose lowering. But what are the risks of letting the glucose ride too high? And how does the loss of muscle mass with aging relate to the development of diabetes? We know that fat mass is important, but we clearly need to know how to better prevent diabetes, and there's a whole session related to that in the afternoon. But can future therapies that increase muscle mass be beneficial to reduce the global burden of diabetes? And that's the future direction of our research, to try and understand how muscle function relates to this increased risk. So I'd like to thank those who have contributed to this work that I described today. And this is our goal for all our older adults with diabetes, that they can jump for joy and not worry about their functional status. And we have a ways to go, but we're working towards it. Thanks for your attention.